Oh,
Got it.
okie doke.
Good afternoon, everyone. As you're all logging on, we want to let everyone know that we have enabled live transcripts. So if you need those subtitles on your end, you can enable them through Zoom. This is also being recorded for those folks who couldn't be with us live this afternoon, and we're excited to share this with you on our YouTube channel afterwards. I'm going to throw it to Lynn Lasher, who's going to get us started with our brief intro about Chris.
All right. Today, we will be hearing about the USS Midway. Our lecture will be given by Chris Day, who has been with the Midway Museum since 2014 and served in the Navy from 1977 to 1984, attaining the rank of lieutenant. Please join me in welcoming Chris Day.
Hello, everybody. Okay, shall we get rolling?
Yeah, let me just let everyone know we are going to have time for Q&A at the end of the event. But if a burning question comes up during the session, you can use the raise hand function or drop it in the chat. But we are going to reserve time at the end if you'd like to wait for that as well. Thank you.
And I'm happy to engage in any and all questions that come up. And we were just talking about the time that I've spent aboard ship with guests. A lot of people will tend to preface something with, "Hey, Chris, I have a dumb question." Well, since less than 1% of the American population has ever served in the military, and about 1% of that is served aboard aircraft carriers, we don't expect people, the common guest, to know much about aircraft carriers. So there are no dumb questions. So when the question comes up, ask away. And what we're going to be focusing on in this talk today are some of the interesting events that occurred during the 47-year career of the USS Midway. Some of them were surprises, some of them were simply major milestones, and some were surprises of a bad nature, which we've entitled disasters. It is a dangerous business out there, both during warfare and when preparing for and training for warfare. Okay, so here she is being built at Newport News, Virginia. Midway was actually, people associate Midway with the Battle of Midway, which was one of the famous sea battles during World War II in the Pacific. And she was certainly named after the Battle of Midway, but she did not participate in the Battle of Midway. The Midway was constructed, she was built during World War II, but was actually commissioned 1 week after the end of hostilities in the Pacific. And many of the lessons learned, the battle in the Pacific was very, very costly to both sides. It was the first war in which aircraft carriers played a very central role. Many aircraft carriers were lost and their crews were lost. Midway, during her design and construction, incorporated some of the lessons learned by both the Japanese and American navies during those conflicts. And at the time, she literally dwarfed everything afloat. She was the first military vessel that was too large to go through the Panama Canal. And that was even before she went through one of two expansions that vastly increased her size. But at the time, she was really a marvel. One of the first interesting operations that Midway was involved in was flying among the icebergs. So we know of Midway as being down here in San Diego. She spent the last part of her life Last 20 years, in fact, from 1973 to 1992, she was home ported in Yokosuka, Japan. Many people don't realize that as part of our mutual defense agreement with the Japanese, we always have an aircraft carrier strike group based in Yokosuka, and we always have an amphibious strike group based there as well. So one of the early operations that she conducted in the North Atlantic rather, was to see how we can conduct flight operations as we get up to and in and around the Arctic Circle. Because so Midway was commissioned in 1945. What were some of the things that started to occur after that? Well, the Cold War. And in this case, I guess it applies both literally and figuratively. We needed to learn how to conduct operations that might be necessary in the North Atlantic to counter the growing threat of the Soviet Union. And that will come up again later when we talk about the Korean conflict. Really tough conditions here during, is there some way that I guess I probably can reduce the size. There we go, so that you can see the whole screen.
We're seeing it nice on our end. It's crystal clear.
Oh, okay. I was seeing a lot of pictures that were blocked, of people that were blocking out some of the captions. So a lot of things to learn how to deal with. Sub-zero conditions out on the flight deck, pushing snow off the flight deck. But we did successfully, this was right about the time that I was born. So this was prior to my era, of course, but they were able to successfully conduct flight operations in and around the Arctic Circle. Operation Sandy is an interesting and little known operation that was conducted off of the USS Midway. If you look really close at the writing on the side of that rocket, you'll see it says German V2 rocket. The end of World War II, we confiscated from the defeated Germans several of their V2 rockets, and Midway was used to test launch a rocket off of a ship for the first time. And here it is in flight. And it was launched off the stern. And so there is people call it the superstructure. We call it the island. People see that, you can see that the rocket kind of started to lean towards the island as it took off. It launched and landed out and destroyed itself upon entry into the Caribbean Sea. Nuclear weapon pioneer. Midway was the first aircraft carrier designed to carry aircraft that could carry nuclear weapons. Here's one of the early ones. Here's one of the later ones. This is a Vigilante. It's about a Mach 2, so twice the speed of sound bomber. And back then, in the early days of nuclear weapons, the aircraft that would drop nuclear weapons needed to be very large because the bombs were bigger. Nowadays, we can drop them off of F-18s, A-6s, a number of much smaller aircraft that can fly off of any aircraft carrier. But back then, the Vigilante, the A3 Sky Warrior, and I think that was a P2 that was in the previous slide, were the aircraft that were large enough to do that and also capable of launching off of an aircraft carrier. Because one of the things you got to realize is a kind of a physics challenge. If you go down to the runway at Lindbergh Field, that runway is about 9,000 feet long. The USS Midway is 1,000 feet long. So we've got to get an aircraft up to about 160, 170 miles an hour in order to take off. So that's a physics challenge there in itself. And we do that by giving it a little bit of an assist in the form of about 300,000 pounds of steam pressure and catapults to help the aircraft get up to speed. And it actually gets up to about 170 miles an hour within about 250 feet. The reason that I mentioned nuclear weapons here is, even though if anybody were to ask a sailor aboard any ship right now, do you guys have nuclear weapons on board? The pat answer is, I can neither confirm nor deny the presence of nuclear weapons aboard the USS Midway. Now that she's decommissioned, I can acknowledge that, yes, Midway used to carry nuclear weapons. In fact, so that brings us to the Korean conflict. People often ask, well, wasn't Midway involved in the Korean War? Answer is no. Midway spent the Korean conflict in the eastern half of the Mediterranean. Why? Because during the Korean conflict, many of the military strategists in Washington thought that there was a huge possibility that the Korean conflict was simply a misdirection play by the Soviet Union to get us to be focusing on the Northwestern Pacific while they would invade Europe, come down through the Fulda Gap into Germany and France and some of our allies there. So Midway, being a nuclear capable aircraft carrier, cruised around that eastern half of the Mediterranean to make sure that the Soviets knew that we had our eye on them. And that sort of, we call it a little bit of a cat and mouse game, played out through my career, through into the 70s and even into the 80s. And that is the Cold War, the constant kind of poking one another that we and the Soviets did. So here what you see is the USS Midway down steaming underway, and that very large 4 turbopropped aircraft going from left to right is an Ilyushin 144 or 142. Actually, its code name for NATO was the Bear. And it is being escorted by an F-4 Phantom off of the Midway. So anytime an aircraft carrier is at sea, we have above it what we call a combat air patrol. That means we've got a couple of fighters that are circling above the entire strike group to act as a defense mechanism. And that's what the F-4 is up there doing, is just reminding that Bear in the air that we could take her down at a moment's notice. The unexpected, another little surprise. Any of you who have seen the movie Top Gun will recognize this as an F-14 Tomcat. Well, Midway was not designed to launch or recover F-14s. The F-14 came along much later, and the F-14 is very much larger than any of today's fighter or attack aircraft, or the previous fighter or attack aircraft, because it was designed to be a very, very high-speed supersonic interceptor, again, built around the Cold War. What happened here was there were some operations being conducted and some bad weather came in over the USS Enterprise, which is where this F-14 was flying off of. And it precluded the F-14 to come back in and land on the Enterprise. That's what we call a bingo condition. That means that if I'm a pilot, the aircraft carrier that I've launched from is no longer available for me to be recovered to. I have to go either to a land-based airport or to another aircraft carrier. In this case, Midway was nearby, and made some special arrangements to get this F-14 back on board, and spent the night, and then launched the next morning to return to the Enterprise. The catapults aboard Midway, since they were not designed for an aircraft as big and heavy as the F-14, were not employed. The F-14 launched with full dual afterburners and launched without the catapult assistance. Shows you how powerful those aircraft are. Mishaps under fire. This Midway did do 3 tours on Yankee Station. Yankee Station is what we called the sea off of North Vietnam to conduct raids against North Vietnamese, and took a lot of heavy anti-aircraft fire and sometimes strikes from other aircraft. And here are a couple of shots of aircraft that made it back, even though they had sustained significant damage. That's why you always got to keep flying. A lot of very interesting air battle accomplishments. This is a great shot. I know why everybody's laughing here, because this is probably a posed picture, because somebody told them, okay, look like your fighter pilots. And there's a saying that you can go into an officers club on any base in any part of the world, and you can always tell the 2 fighter pilots talking, because they talk with their hands like that. There we were. He was coming in out of the sun high. And some more interesting combat humor. This commode that you'll see under the leftmost pylon on the wing here was dropped over North Vietnam as a symbolic gesture of, I think it was the 6 million pound mark, in that we had dropped 6 million pounds of ordnance on Vietnam. And these are interesting aircraft. These guys they're not fast. As you can see, it's a single propeller plane. They hold a bunch of smaller bombs in the range of 200 pounds, 250 pounds. They have 4 20-millimeter cannons that blast out of the wings, and they're primarily used for close-in air support over jungle warfare to help the troops out on the ground in Vietnam. And there was a time that 2 of them were flying together on one of these support missions, and a Soviet MiG snuck up supersonic behind them and fired a couple missiles at him. Well, the missiles missed. The MiG, turned out it was going so much faster than these guys that it overtook them and zoomed out in front of them. And both of the pilots had enough presence of mind to open up with their 20-millimeter cannons, and they shot the MiG down. So in spite of being much slower, much lower tech, presence of mind enabled us to have an air combat victory there, which again shows that it's all about people, not equipment. Operation Frequent Wind occurred at the end of the Vietnam conflict. So again, Midway did 3 different tours off of Vietnam, and during that time actually had shot down both the first and the last MiG of the Vietnam conflict. Operation Frequent Wind was in 1975, after the war had been over for a year and a half or so, and we were evacuating our allies out of Saigon during what's called the Fall of Saigon. And Midway took on board over 3,000 Vietnamese civilians who had to get out of Saigon very quickly. And some of you have probably seen film footage of these, but there were helicopters coming into Midway and a couple of other aircraft carriers from all over Vietnam. And they weren't necessarily helicopters from the Midway. They were just Marine helicopters, Navy helicopters, Air Force helicopters, bringing people out until there was no room on the decks for them. And the helicopters had no fuel to stay in the air. So they had to use tractors to push the helicopters overboard to make room for the people that were coming on board. But in the end, again, they did rescue over 3,000 Vietnamese civilians, transported them to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, and most of them were patriated into the United States via some accommodations at Camp Pendleton. Naval Aviation Pioneer, no, we did not launch the space shuttle off the Midway, but what you see there on the left is the optical landing system. We call it the meatball because when you're flying in from several miles behind the Midway and you're lining up for your landing, before you can see any detail on deck, what you can see when you're lined up appropriately is that middle cell of that middle vertical row. The light is lined up with the wide horizontal row of white lights. And if what you're seeing is a cell that's higher is lit up, means you're too high and you need to cut power. If the cell below that flat line is illuminated, then you're too low and you need to add power. And it is also designed to move as the ship moves in the seas. So it's a very stable, very high-tech, still used today landing system. And some of the technology that was used in developing that went on to be used in navigation of the space shuttle. I'd mentioned before that even in peacetime, it's a dangerous business preparing for war. You can barely make out the writing on the bow of that ship. It's called the Cactus. It is a, gosh, what was its nationality? I think it was a Philippine freighter that was full of timber. And the Midway was in the Philippine Sea, was being trailed, as often happened during the 70s and 80s, by a couple of Soviet trawlers that were really intelligence gathering ships. So in order to ditch those intelligence gathering ships and get out and do what they wanted to do, Midway went, and the rest of her strike group went, and I keep referring to strike groups. Let me clarify that while I'm here. Anytime a aircraft carrier goes to sea, it's typically going to sea with a carrier group that will consist of also 4 or 5 destroyers, a guided missile cruiser, and a couple of nuclear submarines. And so those other vessels are all there simply to protect the aircraft carrier so that the aircraft carrier can focus on her line of business, which is conducting projection of power ashore. Anyway, so to get rid of that, the Soviet trawlers, everybody suddenly went MCON, which means emissions control, lights out, which means completely dark, changed course and changed speed. Well, it was in the Philippine Sea where there's a lot of other shipping, and there was a cargo ship out there, the Cactus, that nobody knew about. And it ended up crashing into the side of the Midway. You can see some damage there along the edge rail. It actually damaged 3 F4s. It killed a couple of sailors that were working in the O2 shack where we generate oxygen and nitrogen, both for our aircraft systems. We always did a lot of fire drills aboard ship. Every sailor, every officer goes to firefighting school because when you're involved in a shipboard fire, you got to put it out or you're in big trouble, because if you're involved in putting it out, it probably means you are one of the few people that's in the same space with the fire. And there have been, I don't know of any major catastrophes aboard Midway, but there certainly have been plenty of major disasters aboard Navy ships caused by fire. So fire drills constantly. Bombing the wrong ship, not what you want to have on your resume. I think this again was in the Philippines, somewhere in the Southwestern Pacific. We had some bombing barges set out, and one of the aircraft dropped a 500-pound bomb on what it thought was a bombing barge, a target, an intended target, and they actually dropped it on one of our own ships. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, although I'm sure that pilot's fitness report suffered. Final combat mission, we tend to think about USS Midway. Well, it's interesting, I look at this photograph and I can tell from the configuration of the island that this is not the Midway. Somebody tried to sneak a picture into, this is one of our more modern Nimitz class nuclear aircraft carriers. But our final combat mission of Midway was actually during the Desert Shield to Desert Storm era in the liberation of Kuwait. Midway was the first aircraft carrier to get into the Persian Gulf. Part of that, of course, was because she was already home ported in Yokosuka. So she was already in the area. She just had to drop down around India, go up through the Strait of Hormuz, into the Persian Gulf. She was joined later by 3 aircraft carriers. Some of the first strikes against Saddam Hussein were launched off of USS Midway, which of course is now ported right here in downtown San Diego. And there's General Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, the future Secretary of State, congratulating the Midway skipper on a job well done. And then fittingly enough, Midway's last mission, she was scheduled to depart the Persian Gulf and come back to San Diego to be decommissioned after 40 years of really, really good, solid, active service. Right about that time, as she was departing, getting back out through the Strait of Hormuz, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted. And Midway was dispatched down there to rescue American civilians from Clark Air Force Base. And this is what it looked like on the outskirts of the Air Force Base, with all the ash and volcanic debris coming down. Oops, what's happening? And this is a shot of the hangar deck. So we've got the flight deck, which is where the aircraft launch and recover on. The hangar deck is the deck down below where we do major repairs. People will ask me, well, isn't this where you park all the aircraft when you're at sea? The answer is actually no. We save the hangar deck for basketball games and volleyball games. No, actually, we save it for major repairs and maintenance that have to be done on aircraft. So we secure all the aircraft topside on the flight deck, unless they have to come down below for some major work. Many other bad days at work that happened along the era here is a jet that it came down on the ramp at the very tail, the very back end of the flight deck. There's an area called the round down or the ramp. And so this guy came in a little bit too slow, which meant he was a little bit too low. And instead of hitting up where the arresting wires are, which you can see ahead of him, it looked like he sheared off his nose gear right on the ramp. Big nasty fireball. Not much left of the aircraft. My understanding is that the pilot was able to walk away from it with only some fairly severe burns on his hands and his feet, where his fireproof flight suit did not cover. Now Midway, of course, has moved on to a new mission. This gentleman here is the Catapult Officer. He's the guy that launches all the aircraft, and we call him the shooter because he gives a signal like this statue right here is giving. This statue is the most photographed man aboard the USS Midway these days. Everybody wants to get a shot taken with the shooter, and it does make for a pretty cool picture. So Midway was decommissioned in 1992. She was hauled back to San Diego. All of the valuable stuff that could be cannibalized and used aboard other ships was pulled off of her, and then she was mothballed, or kind of covered up and battened up and hauled back to Washington State, to Bremerton, where she was kept in mothballs for a while. And it took San Diego about the next 10 years to decide whether or not it would be a good candidate to serve as a museum down on our waterfront. A lot of people thought, oh, it'll be a waste of money. Well, the fact is that Midway is cash positive. We make money. We actually donate money to a lot of first responder and military family organizations throughout our community. The Navy doesn't put a single penny into that. It's all based on ticket fees and donations. And so the museum opened up in 2004, right about the same time that that Petco Park opened up for the Padres, and has been operating in the black ever since. And we've got, I can't remember if I've got this number in here later, but we now see, we're still working our way back up to it after COVID, but just prior to COVID, we were averaging about 1.5 to 1.7 million visitors a year. TripAdvisor.com ranks Midway as the number 6 most visited museum in the United States. And that's on a list that includes things like the Getty, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So it's the number 1 attraction in San Diego. There are opportunities for any of you who would like to get involved. Lots of volunteer opportunities. All you really need to do is call down to the ship and tell them that you'd like to get involved in doing something, and the folks down there will help you figure out what you can do. A lot of neat people that do stuff down there, and we have a number of really other interesting missions too. We have a lot of youngsters pictured here. One of the reasons that we have that is that we have what we call the Midway University on board, where high school and sometimes younger kids come down, and we use some of the real tangible physical attributes of a Navy warship to teach science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to kids. I guess we probably get some art in there somewhere. So I was going to say STEM, but it may be STEAM. We have some of the things that are kind of artful around. There's also an opportunity for any of you who might be so inclined. Midway does accept donations. Donations are matched, and we don't use any of that stuff for things aboard this ship. All of that's paid for by ticket prices. What we do is we redistribute that among local active duty servicemen and women, veterans, families, Gold Star families, and police and firefighters and other first responders. You can also become a member of the museum. I should have researched, I'm not sure exactly where the ticket prices have gotten to. I think a ticket to get in for the average public is $22. I think for about $80, you can get a year-long membership, and you can go down there as many times as you want and take up to 4 guests. And you get the opportunity to go on some behind-the-scenes tour, because we don't have the entire ship open to the public. We have some spaces that are representative of pretty much everything that went on aboard Midway. But but there are 2,000 different compartments aboard the ship, so it would be a little bit much to monitor and conduct tours and all of it. And some of the tours are really, really neat. Sick Bay, I think, is one of our great tours, and it's a good example of public-private partnerships. Kaiser Permanente joined us on that, and they helped us set up with mannequins, both on the operating table and acting as doctors. We've got tools, surgical tools laid out. You go in there and you think you've entered an operation. So there are a lot of really, really neat stuff that kids of all ages, as we say, can go down and enjoy. And we've got a lot of guys like myself hanging around in yellow hats, our docents. You don't have to be a veteran to be a docent, but most of us are retired Marine Corps or Navy. And, we'll answer any question you've got. We'll tell you what life was like aboard these ships. And, they say about sailors is that we love to make up a good sea story. So if you ask us a question we don't have an answer for, you're probably going to get an answer anyway. And that's it. Thank you all very, very much for listening to me, for allowing me to join your group today. And we can now figure out how to open this up to allow for questions.
I'm going to go ahead and remove that screen sharing. So if folks want to go on gallery mode, that way we can all see each other. And if anyone has any questions, now's your chance.
Marilyn.
I know that the different colored jackets on the flight deck represent different jobs, because I know one had yellow, but I know there is green and something and something and something. What do they represent?
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. It's completely accurate. That's so that when you're sitting up in your cockpit and you're taxiing down the flight deck, you can tell who you should pay attention to at what particular time. So the yellow, which you mentioned first, which is probably good, because as a pilot, you're going to pay the most attention to the yellow guys because they're the plane directors. They're the guys who are going to be out there at night with the handheld lanterns, giving you the signals, turn right, turn left, go straight forward. Because imagine, I spoke a little bit about doing catapult launches. You connect your aircraft to the ship via a device called a saddle that connects your nose gear to the ship and to the catapults. You can't see your nose gear from where you're sitting in the cockpit. So you have to rely on a 19-year-old sailor out there to do his job 100% right. There are the green shirts. The green shirts are the guys out there that both connect you and deconnect you from the ship. So they're guys that connect you to the catapult for launch, and they help do all of the gear rigging and disconnect you from the arresting gear after you recover. There are white shirts who are the plane checkers. They're the guys who kind of keep an eye over everybody's shoulder to make sure that everybody's following procedures. And they will also do a last pass on your aircraft to make sure that it does still appear to be ready to go on a mission. You've got two kinds of red shirts. The red shirts, one of them are the ordnance men, and they're the guys that are going to come around your aircraft, make sure your weapons look like they're all secure and ready to go. And then they're going to arm your weapons. And they're going to come back around to your side of the cockpit and hold up so that you can see them 10 different red tags, which means you've got 10 weapons that are now armed. Another red shirt is the fire crews, and you won't typically see them around unless your plane's on fire. Let me see, who else do we have? We've got the purple crews, the goofy grapes. They're the guys that both fuel and defuel your aircraft, because once we land, after we're done conducting missions, we don't want to have planes sitting around on deck that have full fuel tanks. And then we've got the brown shirts who are the plane captains. Now I see your question here, do they rotate? No, they typically, they change jobs. If I'm a yellow shirt, I'm going to rotate in and out with other yellow shirts. But I'm not going to go put a green shirt on for the next day, because these jobs are all technical enough and they are all so absolutely critical. As a pilot, you are likely to outrank all these guys. The average, and I say man, because during Midway's time, it was all men that served aboard warships. The women started serving aboard warships in 1994, which was both after my day and it was after USS Midway's active day. So pardon me for that slip, but the average age of these young men on the flight deck is 19. And yet your life is in their hands, and their lives are in one another's hands. They've got to do their job perfectly, otherwise you might have a bad launch. They've also got to pay attention to what they're doing, because I can't do my job perfectly, let's say as a green shirt, hooking you up to a catapult, and then stand up and go, okay, I'm done, and turn around and walk into a propeller or walk over the edge of a ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So it's tough duty out there in the flight deck, and it's always noisy. It's always either too hot or too cold, not just by a little bit, by a lot. It's a tough working environment. Good questions. Who else has got something? Mike.
I've got a question. I visited the Midway several years ago, and recently I saw a picture of the flight deck, and it appears there's a lot more aircraft that is now on top of the Midway. Are these just aircraft that are no longer in use, or were damaged, or, I mean, it was huge, the difference from when I was there.
Yeah, very good question, Mike. We have been adding, I don't know how many more we'll be adding, but our goal has been to have on the flight deck a representative of every aircraft that ever flew off the USS Midway. So they aren't additional. So we've got the single propeller fighters. We've also got F-18s. We have an F-14 because of that one incident that I told you about when the F-14 flew off of Midway. We won't have any F-35s because they will not be flying off Midway. But we, every once in a while, come upon an opportunity to salvage an aircraft. And then we've got a hangar over at North Island Naval Air Station where we have guys, and these guys are the volunteers that are truly the lifeblood of the ship. They are the aircraft and the ship restoration guys. We, with our yellow hats, our job is just to go out there and take credit for the work that they do.
Okay. Time for me to get back there.
Yeah, it's always a great day. I really enjoy my time down aboard the ship a lot. Anybody else? You guys should ask away. These are good questions so far.
How many people on the ship?
Very good question. Typically, when Midway went to sea, about 4,500. And that's approximately half and half between the ship's crew and all of the squadrons of aviators that are on board. So the ship's crew would be right at about 2,300 guys. And the squadrons are actually, they're the squadron detachments. You'll have detachments from about 7 different squadrons on board the ship when she deploys. And they're detachments that come from other squadrons that may be based at Miramar or Yuma, Arizona, or Alameda in Northern California. And they each send a group of both pilots and all of their support crew. So that would make up again about half the ship's contingent, but about 4,500 guys aboard the ship. A couple of other interesting numbers games on that. So all of that, so 70,000 tons of ship, about 65 aircraft, about 4,500 crew members, all to support 200 aviators, 200 pilots. That's what it takes. Some of the other, as you think an aircraft carrier is something that big, you'd be pretty independent for a long time. During Desert Storm, we were resupplying at sea every 3 days because we were going through that much fuel, aviation fuel, ordnance, dropping a lot of bombs, and food. We're serving 13,000 meals a day. So you got your basic 3 meals a day, plus what we call mid-rats, which is we have a couple of the galleys open at midnight for those poor souls, one of which was me, many of my years, who are standing the dog watch or the mid-watch. Yeah, Mike.
Just another quick question. How does the size of the Midway compare to the new aircraft carriers that are out?
That is a good question. So it is not significantly different. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit. Midway was actually built as a straight deck aircraft carrier. So she didn't have that angled deck that you now see aboard that ship and aboard all the other aircraft carriers. That was added during the 70s when we started launching and recovering jet aircraft. Actually, it was done first during the 50s and then again during the 70s when we actually increased the angle, if you will, from an 11 to a 13-degree angle. So Midway is about 1,004 feet long and displaces about 70,000 tons when fully loaded for deployment. The modern Nimitz-class nuclear aircraft carriers are only about 80 feet longer, but they're about half again bigger. So they're about 100,000 tons. So the weight has increased by about 50%, but the length only about 10%. Arthur.
I've been on the Midway and really enjoyed the tour that we got. And I've also been proud to participate on the Carl Vinson 2 years in a row in doing Passover Seders in the officers' mess, where we had about 60 or 7 chaplains and Jewish personnel at the Seders. And the Midway didn't quite seem as big. Maybe it's the width, or it just seemed like the Vincent was so much larger than the Midway. But from what you're saying, it's not, as far as length is concerned.
Yeah, not lengthwise. It is, the newer ones are wider, they're deeper. The other thing that may contribute to that is the fact that all of the spaces are open and available. You know, Midway, we've got yellow chains hanging up around where, so we kind of, I guess probably 20% of the ship is open and available for visiting by guests.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
There's a new question in the chat.
How quickly can you launch planes? Susan, good question. So we have 2 catapults that we use for launching aircraft. Cat 1 on the right-hand side, the starboard side, Cat 2 on the port side. Each of them operates on a 90-second cycle. So each of them can launch an aircraft every minute and a half, and they alternate so that we can put an aircraft in the air every 45 seconds, which means I can put a strike team in the air towards a target of 12 to 15 heavily armed aircraft in about 10 minutes. And if we are steaming such that we have a higher threat level, we can, in addition to having one or two of the CAP, the Combat Air Patrol aircraft that I described being airborne, we can, as soon as they launch, we can queue up two more fighters in the catapults and have an aviator stationed in the flight seat, ready to hit the button and go at any time. So it's a very, very fast response.
Good for us.
I got one more question for you, then I'll be quiet.
Well, you don't have to be quiet, Mike. You're speaking up. That's good.
One of the concerns I have about the aircraft carriers is they look like a floating target for submarines, for torpedoes, things of that nature. What kind of protections are there to protect against torpedoes and things of that nature on a ship that huge?
Very good question. That, of course, is a subject of, I'm still a member of the Naval Institute, US Naval Institute, and that's something that's debated all the time. It is, in one sense, it's putting all your eggs in one basket, or in this case, 11 baskets, because we have 11 active aircraft carriers. On the other hand, so the things that we've got to protect, a torpedo would probably not be a major threat, because torpedoes have somewhat limited range compared to other weapons that we'll discuss in a moment. And we usually, again, I can neither confirm nor deny, we'll have a couple of attack submarines along with an aircraft carrier strike group. The best defense against another submarine, best defense against a submarine is another submarine. They can sit out there and go silent and simply listen. And one of the things that American technology has done better than any of our competitors, although they are catching up, is that our submarines are quieter than the other submarines, and that is a huge advantage. The next level of protection we've got are the 4 or 5 destroyers that would be cruising way out, a couple of miles distance from the aircraft carrier, each patrolling different sectors in random patterns relative to the course and speed of the aircraft carrier. The destroyers are both protection against a surface threat, which a submarine or a torpedo could launch from also, but they're also very good ASW or anti-submarine warfare platforms. They can launch helicopters to drop suspended hanging sonar. They have highly sophisticated sonar systems themselves and can employ a number of different rocket and gravity launched and torpedo borne warheads against submarines or against other surface ships or even against torpedoes. The guided missile cruiser is there with its main mission being to keep the entire strike group underneath its anti-aircraft umbrella. So its big advantage is massive, highly sophisticated radar and other detection systems. in a very, very highly sophisticated set of anti-aircraft countermeasures, missiles, other things like that. So you've got several layers of defense against all those elements. The last layer that the aircraft carrier will have, in addition to the combat air patrol, I give there a couple of other things here. So the combat air patrol, you've got aircraft that you can send up to a long ways out, a couple hundred miles out, and they can go up very high, 35,000 feet, and look down on a lot of stuff. The Navy has what's called a Navy Tactical Data System, which means what I see, you see. So let's say you're on the aircraft carrier, Maryland's on a destroyer, Lynn's on a submarine, and I'm flying an F-14 somewhere. Anything that I detect shows up on your screen. So we are all fully aware of what's going on, and we can all be prepared. We've also got a last ditch called a Seaways close-in weapon system, which is a 6-barreled Gatling gun. It shoots out rounds that each weigh about 6 pounds. They're made out of spent radium. The reason they use that metal is because it's denser than lead. And it sends them out at a rate of about 3,000 rounds per minute.
Mm.
And it is a self-contained system. It has its own radar, its own fire control. All you do is send it a signal. This is your target. It locks onto that target. And as soon as you press the big red button, it expends all of its ordnance against that target and puts up basically a wall of metal that is denser than lead. But the big question that you probably noticed that I haven't opened up is that of ballistic missile threat. There are lots of other threats that will come at us probably someday in layers. Things like cyber threats, messing with our infrastructure back here in the 50 states, messing with communication abilities out at sea, interrupting our satellites. That's why we still teach celestial navigation at the academy. Someday that satellite that you're relying on with your GPS might not be there. You better learn how to shoot the stars. And there are even weapon systems and detection systems that are in various stages of deployment that may be effective at countering those. So you're right, Mike. It is a big question. It's an important question. It's hotly and frequently debated. But I think one of the things that we've seen recently in a few of the conflicts that we've had is that when the time comes for us to project power ashore in an area where we have no friendly airports to operate from, an aircraft carrier is indispensable. And I think I have a related. Why does Congress refuse to spend money for upgrades and better salaries for personnel? Well, gosh, that was always my question too, Marilyn. I don't even know. I have some opinions, but I probably ought not go there. As they say,
Such a valuable job, and underpaid personnel doesn't seem using our money well.
It does sometimes seem like that, doesn't it? But the truth is, it's really it was a wonderful time in my life. When I was doing that, I wouldn't trade it for anything. It helped me go on to. So if I look at my overall life compensation, I've done fairly well. And I've got to give the Navy a lot of credit for that, because it instilled in me a lot of the discipline and tenacity and focus that I was able to employ effectively later in life. I still, if I had a chance to give it all up again and go back and be 22 again, I'd do it. I mean, wouldn't we all? That's kind of, but yeah, I'd go give it another run. It's an honorable profession.
Well, seeing as there are no more questions and we're just rounding out our time at the hour mark, I want to thank everyone for being here and thank Chris for taking the time. For those of you that have not visited the Midway, I hope this has been your sales pitch to make sure you get yourself down to the harbor and go see it in person and take one of the tours. If there are any other questions, we can connect you with Chris offline and make sure that everyone gets to kind of chat about things that they're very interested in. Lynn, anything else to close out?
Just want to let everyone know that on March 24th, we'll have another speaker, probably just as wonderful as Chris was.
Can't possibly be that good.
Well, this was fantastic. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, guys. Have a great day.